I'll try and keep it fairly short, just because I think generally with these things, questions are a better way to go. But the first thing to say is this year is a really big, important year for us internationally. Later this year, we're going to host COP26, and we've got lots of ambitions there, trying to get more countries to declare their position on NDCs, that's their nationally determined contributions to carbon reduction. Earlier this year, we committed to increase our NDC target for 2030 to 68%. Those of you on the call, because you follow these things closely, will also be aware that a few weeks ago, we adopted the recommendation of the Climate Change Committee for Carbon Budget 6, and that commits us to a 78% reduction by 2035. And that's, again, very important because it's an important staging post on the way to net zero. And we are, we were the first country in the world to legally commit to net zero by 2050. Now, it's also a big year for the environment in another way, and that is the Convention on Biodiversity meets in China later this year. And the so-called Aichi targets, which were set about a decade ago in Japan, and which relate to biodiversity and getting the world to think more about nature and biodiversity, those are being reviewed at this point. And we've been doing huge amounts of work to try to get momentum behind an agenda that builds on those targets and gets more meaningful, more granular commitments from countries towards helping biodiversity, but also gets more money committed for projects through climate change finance that will actually support nature and biodiversity as well. So we've got something that the Prime Minister launched late last year called the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which basically all of those signing up to it will commit to protect 30% of their terrestrial landscape by 2030, and also commit to those sort of more meaningful targets as we review the Aichi targets. So a busy year, a lot going on, and of course, as we move forward, we need to make sure we've got the tools to deliver these ambitious targets that we're setting. It does require quite a lot of change, and it does require some quite big leaps forward in technology on a number of fronts, but there's quite a lot of positive action there. The other area I wanted to address is something where I did a speech yesterday, which some of you may have seen some reporting on, but we published our peat strategy, and there's lots and lots of policy in there, but the key sort of headlines from it are that the government now intends to ban the use of peat in the amateur horticulture sector. Roughly 80% of the peat that's used in horticulture is actually often misused by gardeners who just buy a bag of peat and use it often as a soil improver, when actually it would be far more effective if they bought instead a bag of horse manure or farmyard manure from the garden centre. Instead, it would do more to improve their soil. And we're taking this step because for those purposes like container grown plants, there are now some very good alternatives, such as coir, such as particular fibres that come from bark and so on. Even sphagnum farming has come on and can have a role to play here. We're now at the position where we think the peat alternatives are good enough, so we should move towards a ban, and we're going to do that by the end of this Parliament, and we'll be doing a consultation later this year. We've also committed to treble the rate at which we restore our degraded peat habitats. So we want to restore around 35,000 hectares by, again, the end of this Parliament, by 2024. And we'll be using our future agriculture policy to incentivise and support farmers to do that. We've recently introduced new restrictions with a ban on the burning of heather on deep peats, so that we can help support those blanket bogs to return to their natural hydrological state. And beyond that as well, we have a task force that's looking at lowland peats, particularly in some of the fenland areas in places like Cambridgeshire, some of our most productive soils, but actually which account for around 87% of carbon emissions from peat. And we want to try to address that. We're looking at some quite novel approaches to managing the water table in some of those particular lands in a way that could actually significantly reduce the carbon emissions from those landscapes. The other key thing that we announced yesterday was our tree strategy. And again, there were many, many different policies in there. But the key thing is that in this Parliament, we want to treble the rate of woodland creation in England. That's going to take it up to around 7,500 hectares each and every year by the end of this Parliament. And we've also as well been working with Scotland and other parts of the UK. And of course, we've overall got a very clear manifesto commitment that by the end of this Parliament, we want to be planting 30,000 hectares of trees each and every year. And that's a significant undertaking. We've not planted anything close to that as a country since the very early 1970s. And even then, it was only maintained for a few short years. So it's a big, ambitious project, but one that we're doing quite a lot of thinking to ensure that we can get that delivered, get landowners to take that particular decision. There's also projects in that tree strategy around an urban tree challenge fund to get more trees into urban landscapes, some funds for local authorities to increase tree planting, particularly to replace trees that might have been lost, the establishment of new community forests. And I know there's proposals for one that have been around for some time in Cornwall. And so we're looking at projects such as that. And we've also decided that we want to introduce a new type of designation. We have protection for veteran trees and we have protection for ancient trees, although I'm sure some on the call will point out that's not an absolute protection, but they are recognised as such. What we've said we want to do now is to introduce protections for long established woodland. That's woodland that it might have been around for say 150 years, isn't therefore classified as ancient woodland, but nevertheless has been a long time establishing itself, will become the ancient woodland of the future, and where frankly we ought to tread with care about losing trees in those kinds of environments. So that's something else that we are also working on when it comes to trees. And then the third big component of the speech that I gave yesterday was around reintroduction of species. And we'll be announcing the result of our consultation on reintroducing beavers, but we are minded to press ahead and set up the system that enables more beaver introductions to take place under license. We've set up a task force to work out how we can manage some of the conflicts and tensions that you can inevitably get, particularly with some species. Usually the large charismatic but carnivorous type of species can cause issues. But you might have seen our view that we should, for instance, reintroduce the golden eagle in this country. And then we're also looking at things like the red-backed shrike as well as another species. And there are many other bird species where we want to try and support reintroductions, not just ones that might be extinct in Britain now and getting them reintroduced, but ones that perhaps are concentrated in some parts of the country but have potential to be introduced in others. And so when it comes to the hen harrier, for instance, there's a lot of interest at the moment whether we could introduce it into other parts of the country to give it a wider range. So a big piece as well on rewilding. Now, underlining all of that, the other thing we made clear yesterday, which has been very well received, is just as we have a net zero target on climate change, it is time for us to really step up and take a decision that we are going to arrest the decline of nature and arrest the decline in biodiversity. And so what I announced yesterday is we intend to bring forward amendments to the Environment Bill that's now about to resume. such as we're going to set basically a target that will seek to reverse the decline in species abundance, and we've chosen species abundance as the right measure to look at, but we want to set a target in 2030 that means we're going to reverse the decline that we've seen in recent decades. Now that's quite a big target, ambitious target. On one level, people might say, gosh, it's going to take that long just to stem the decline, but the species abundance index that's used typically looks at around 600 species and charts the course of each of them. And what we'd be seeking to do is make sure that we arrest that decline. The final thing I just want to say before going to questions is on all of these things, we can set these targets, but it's critically important that we have the tools to deliver them. That's why one of the other things that we're going to do is to have a power to amend some of our habitat regulations so that we can change the nature of the duties that there are on public bodies to bring it into line with these new targets that we've set. So we're going to be setting lots of different targets in the Environment Bill, and we've got this new target on biodiversity. We need to make sure that the way we approach regulatory and conservation functions is squarely aligned with this highly ambitious framework that we've set out now in the Environment Bill. And then we have to have the tools to deliver it. And we've got a number that we've been working on. First of all, we are transforming our future agriculture policy so that we will be, over the next 7 years, phasing out the arbitrary area payments that existed before and paying farmers for what they do for environmental assets. So things that under the old Common Agricultural Policy might have been described as an ineligible feature that you could not claim money on. So areas of woodland that could not be grazed, you weren't allowed to claim for. Water features and ponds in the farm landscape, a mecca for wildlife, not allowed to claim for. We almost want to turn things on their head and say, you know what, that is what we want to pay for. If you have some woodland, we want to pay you to manage it well, so we maximize its value for nature. We want to reward you for having those water features because they create a sanctuary and a refuge and space for nature, and we want to help you manage them well. We want you to manage your hedgerows in a particular way, so that, again, hedgerows are probably the single most important building block that we have for ecology in the farmed landscape. And we also want to be supporting and paying farmers and rewarding farmers for managing their soils in a way that's sustainable, because we know that if you have healthy soils managed well, you can also get some quite rapid returns in biodiversity in soil and an improvement in soil health. So a lot will be done through that changing on the agriculture policy. And then in addition to that, we've introduced the concept through the Environment Bill of biodiversity net gain. And that means that if a developer builds houses, not only must they repair any damage that has been done by the building of those new developments, they must provide net gain of 10% as well. And that means that we will see additional funds going to nature's recovery, particularly in local areas. And to back this up, we're requiring local authorities to have local nature recovery strategies that will set out how they intend to use these new funds that will be coming their way, and how they also intend to embed nature and space for nature in any new developments that take place. And we're also looking at nature recovery networks that will sort of link up these different local strategies so that there's some strategic oversight, and Natural England can deal with some strategic issues, particularly when it comes to things like water quality. So I hope that's a bit of a sort of trot round the course. There is enormous amounts going on both, internationally. Of course, let's not forget, I know in Cornwall we're obviously hosting G7 as well. Climate change and the environment is going to be very prominent on the G7 agenda. I know the Prime Minister is really keen to do that. So a big year internationally, a big year for Cornwall since it's hosting G7, and a huge amount going on this particular policy front, but not ahead of time, because the twin challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss is a really big challenge that we all must take seriously.
Thank you, George. That's brilliant. I don't know if you're aware, but I thought I'd, from a challenge from constituents, I thought I'd try and capture all that has been achieved and pledged and promised in a report since 2015, since I became an MP, but also just starting at 2008 in terms of the setting up of the Commission on Climate Change. The document ended up, without a lot of waffle, some might disagree, to be 50 pages long. So there's a massive amount of information out there about our attempts and intention to get to net zero, as you've described. Thank you very much. What we're going to do, I'm going to get the panel members to ask the questions, and I'll include myself in that. But I will ask the panel to just introduce who they are when they ask their first question, George, so you know who you're having to deal with. And but thank you very much. And obviously, when your time is running out, just give us some indication. So Pippa, I'll start with you. So if you could introduce yourself, Pippa, and then you've got a question for George.
Well, my name is Pippa Stilwell, and I'm a climate ambassador for the WI. And my question is, first of all, to the Secretary of State, many thanks for joining us this evening. It's been really interesting. What I want to know is, will the Environment Bill contain legally binding targets for reducing pollution in air and water?
Okay, yes, the short answer is yes. So the Environment Bill requires us by October 2022 to set at least one target for 4 areas, and that's water quality, air quality, biodiversity, and waste and resource management. Now, my view at the moment is that in each of those areas, we will probably want to set more than one target, since if you only set one target on things like water, then you end up having some kind of composite target of all sorts of different factors, and it doesn't particularly tell you the full story of what's going on, and can drive perverse incentives where people focus only on a few waterways because they want to get them just above the line. So but yes, the short answer is by October 2022 we will have legally binding targets set in all of those 4 areas, including air and water.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Julia.
Sorry about that. Hello. Yes, my name's Julia Havard. I'm a climate ambassador with the WI, with Pippa, and I'm also the equivalent with Truro Diocese, so that's now a creation care champion. My question is, when can we expect a net zero strategy which comprehensively outlines a planning framework across all the government departments to achieve net zero by 2050? It isn't in the Environment Bill. When can we expect to see that? And I say that because people are going to need a lot of help to make all the big changes that are expected of them. So we wait to see that detail.
Yes, well, Julia, we do. So BEIS is the department that leads overall on our on the Climate Change Act and the targets that we have within that, and also our sort of national inventory on these matters. But we do annually. There is a report from the Climate Change Committee, which obviously reviews our progress. And actually, its last report was quite positive, because of course it's always important, in my view, that we recognise what we have achieved, while also recognising there's a lot more to do. Because I think I'm of the view that if unless people acknowledge what's been achieved, the journey ahead just feels impossible and daunting. But we've already reduced our carbon emissions by 40%. Most of that's come through deployment of renewable energy. And we are setting out now basically how we will hit each of those carbon budgets, carbon budget 5 and 6, and then on to net zero. And the critical areas are in my area in DEFRA, the tree planting target that we have of 30,000 hectares of trees by the end of the Parliament each and every year, combined with the targets we have on peat restoration, combined with some quite novel work we're doing on feed additives that could reduce methane emissions from livestock, for instance, and other factors as well around soil health and soil management. We're working out now how all of those different components fit together and within what time frame to hit the various carbon budgets that we are committed to. The Department for Transport are looking obviously very closely at electrification of cars, of vehicles. So we're going to have a ban on the sale of new diesel and petrol cars in 2030. That means basically everything will be electric. And we're already seeing the market move quite quickly with electric vehicle technology coming on in leaps and bounds because they can see the direction of travel. They are also doing some work looking at the possible role for things like hydrogen power when it comes to shipping, which is another big emitter of carbon, soon to be added to the inventory. So something that we will need to be addressing. And then if you look at MHCLG, who deal with local government, the really big dilemma that they're focusing on is, first of all, how can we get the planning system and building regulations right so that on all new homes we build, they are carbon neutral. And there's a lot of thinking going on that. But then crucially as well, how do we retrofit all of those boilers that exist in gas boilers that exist in people's houses now, so that their carbon emissions are lower. And so there's quite a lot of thinking because we won't get there on some of those later targets unless we can come up with a solution, a technological solution that enables us to retrofit or change some of those boilers. And so there's some quite good creative thinking going on in that space, but they're not there yet. So I think we do give a response each year. I think BEIS give a response to the report that comes from the Climate Change Committee, setting out what it is that we are doing to try to hit the targets that we've set. And they obviously have a scrutiny role in that as well. I hope that's a sort of summary of how we're held to account for what we're doing and how we try to explain what we're doing.
Thank you,
Thanks, George. So Jonathan.
Hello, thank you, George, for that presentation. I'm Jonathan Howe. I'm a Penzance Town Councillor, and actually since yesterday evening I've been the Mayor. So
congratulations.
So Penzance has a Green Party Mayor, and I'm pleased to tell you. So I wanted to ask a few, well, grouped together really, a few questions around farming. I mean, I was interested in the announcement about older farmers being given 50,000 plus or whatever to leave the profession and to get younger people in. I was wondering, what was the other side of that? Will there be loads of sort of extra money into education and awareness raising to try and get younger people into farming? And I just scanning the questions here, though, there's a few others. Jane Malishko asked, would it be possible to offer landowners any incentives to allow designated cycleways across their land? So that obviously applies to farming. Loveday Jenkins has asked a few questions around, for instance, tree policies and so on, but particularly Cornish hedges, that they're not included in DEFRA assessments, apparently. So it's to do with awareness raising in the farming profession, really, I suppose.
Yes, the consultation that we've just issued today, it really aims to do something quite different. And by the way, there are quite a lot of older farmers who are very environmentally aware, know their land, and will do these schemes. So it's less, it's not so much about that. It's just there is a problem we have at the moment in that, because we've had under the Common Agricultural Policy basically just a straight area-based subsidy that paid money to people really just for occupying the land and having land tenure. it's been a subsidy on land occupation, really. It's meant that the biggest payments have gone to the largest, usually the wealthiest landowners, while the small family farm tends to get a relatively small amount, and it doesn't make it any easier for them. And what we're really trying to do is unravel some of those distortions. And one of the problems with the system we've got is it has, in some cases, meant that a lot of farmers have put off the decision to retire, and have carried on in some ways sort of muddling through a bit, collecting the subsidy payment, not always, farming the land, in a particularly productive way. And in doing so, they've also made it harder for new entrants. And there are lots of people out there. The demand for agricultural colleges, as Dutchie told me, is the highest it's been for a very, very long time. There are increasingly people who went away to get a big shot career somewhere, but actually now feel they want to get back into doing something that's fulfilling, that has meaning. And there's increasingly people that do want to go farming in later life, possibly in their 40s when they have a family and they want to sort of move back to the country. And what we know is that unless you support and help some farmers retire with dignity, it's very hard to have the opportunities for those new farmers to come through. And you can end up with land rents being too high, such that farming's not really viable for those new businesses anyway. So we want to have sort of more vibrancy where those who probably should retire can be encouraged to face a decision, and we're therefore going to give them effectively a kind of double dose, if you like, of their BPS payments to help them confront that decision, pay off some of the creditors, maybe pay down their overdraft a bit so that they can retire with dignity. And we know that if we encourage that and support that, there's more opportunities for the new entrants as well. Now then, on your other 2 points on cycling, yes, this is something that the Treasury are also quite interested in, is whether when it comes to nature we can join up the work of the Department for Transport and local authorities and DEFRA, so that we really support public access in these areas. And they are quite interested in looking at some of these schemes, whether we can use some of the funds that we have to support things that could even include extending cycle routes. And on Loveday's point about trees, the one thing I can actually guarantee is that Cornish stone hedges will now be properly recognised and will be rewarded when we introduce our new hedgerow scheme. In fact, I think it was Devon trees that for a while were not counted as, Devon hedges that were not counted as hedges. I suppose we all care deeply about Devon, but this is, in the days of the EU membership, this is the sort of thing that used to preoccupy me. In Devon, they have these banks, and they have a bank with some sort of scrub on top, and there was a debate about whether that could be defined as a hedge, because the growth on the hedge under EU law had to be at least, I think, 2 meters high before it could be deemed a hedge. And Cornwall has sometimes suffered similar problems, that the actual stone built bit of the hedge wasn't really counted as the hedge. They only measured the growth on top. And we all know in Cornwall, if you get gale force winds, things don't always grow as tall as you'd like on top. And we also know that on a Cornish stone hedge, you've actually got a mecca for wildlife, within the heart of that stone hedge that you've got there. So it is something that we will recognise in our new system. But it was a quirk of EU definitions in the old scheme.
Thank you, George. George, I'm going to take you slightly outside of your department. There's been quite a lot of questions in the chat, in the question answer function, because I think recent media reports about the government support for new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. Have you got a view about, or do you understand a bit about why the government are allowing that to happen in light of our commitment to reducing carbon emissions?
Yeah, it's a difficult and contentious issue, but I suppose the truth on gas is gas first of all, the earliest sort of hydrogen technologies coming is probably going to be what they call blue hydrogen, which is often derived from splitting gas and then capturing the CO2 and sequestering it, and then having a sort of clean hydrogen fuel at the end of it. So, and if you didn't have the gas, then you probably would delay the deployment of hydrogen technology, and that you won't have done a clever day's work if that's the case. The second thing, just to bear in mind, is the great success we've had on renewables, particularly offshore wind. In some ways is only really possible if it's complemented with some gas at the moment, because the one thing about a gas power station is you can just switch it on and off. So when the wind blows and you have plenty of renewable energy, you can shut down all of your gas power. And that's different, by the way, to say coal. And, you know, in the old coal fire stations, they just ran and they gave you what they used to call base load, but they just kept burning non-stop. So there is an argument, until we sort of perfect these things, if we want to increase our reliance on renewable energy, complementing that with gas that you can switch on and off as and when you need it, does have a case for it. So these things, as ever, are quite complicated, and that's why you know, sometimes there's a role for gas, probably in the sort of medium term, while we get these technologies, because without it we would probably slow down the deployment of some of the green technologies that are actually quite crucial to getting where we want to get to.
Thanks, George. Pippa, have you got a question there on the?
Well, there are lots of questions about woodlands and tree planting, which we can scoop up. And I think that a major concern, well, two major concerns is, one is that all these new trees, are they going to be native trees? They're not going to be more timber, which gives habitat starved of wildlife. They need to be native trees. And the other thing is, it's incredibly important to protect the woodlands that we already have, which is not happening with HS2. I understand there's a development in Basingstoke where 60 ancient oak trees are going to be felled to make way for an Amazon warehouse. There just don't seem to be the protections there when there's some kind of conflict of interest, and we would like to see those quickly.
Yes, on the native broadleaf trees and the balance with conifers, it's something we're looking very closely at, and we definitely want to make sure. At the moment, the balance in our current planting is around, I think it's 70 to 80% is broadleaf tree plantations. This is in England, and the balance is mainly conifers. In Scotland, it's the other way around, actually. That they do achieve higher tree planting rates, but a significant proportion of that is commercial forestry with conifer plantations. We know that native broadleaf trees do deliver more for biodiversity and for nature, and that's why we're keeping a close eye on that. And we, you know, internally, we've had a differential incentive so that we're paying more by way of a maintenance grant for those landowners who establish broadleaf trees. And we want to try and make sure that we keep that balance so that it's the majority is broadleaf, but not rule out some conifers as well. And the reason I think we need some commercial forestry is it comes back to what I said earlier. If you say it all has to be broadleaf, well, then you'll be doing two things. We import nearly all of our timber at the moment. If we want to be using less plastics, then probably using renewable natural materials like timber is going to be more important, sustainably sourced with woodlands properly managed, and then trees sequentially obviously replanted after you fell. But at the moment, what we do is we import all our timber and cut down other people's trees to get the wood that we need. So there is probably going to be growing demand for timber as we move away from plastics, and I think we would probably say that that is a good thing. It's a natural but renewable natural resource. But also, to get the tree planting rates we need to get the carbon sequestration, we probably will need to have lots of different tools to get there, including some of those sort of commercial plantations. So we're trying to keep a balance. and I recognise your point, but we'll probably need a range of different things. And then on the, I mean, as I mentioned, we are introducing a new protection for long established woodland. We are in discussion with colleagues in the MHCLG, which deals with planning, to discuss things like, you know, tree preservation orders as well. I personally would like us to explore ways of trying to strengthen some of the protections for trees. Just instinctively, I feel that trees take a very, very, very long time to grow. Huge amounts goes into getting an adult tree that's hundreds of years old, and if you've got a veteran tree, you know, in some ways it's a terrible tragedy when you lose those. We all understand that occasionally there will be certain projects or infrastructure that can't be done in anywhere else, and therefore sometimes you will lose some of those trees. But we are looking at ways to see how we can strengthen some of those protections.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Julia? Sorry, Julia, you're on mute.
Sorry. There's a number of questions here about peat. I'm going to take this one from Jill Bruce. She says, I welcome today's announcement on the ban on domestic peat sales from 2024 and commercial from 2030. Government had requested some years ago that these should be stopped by 2020. Surely this can be done sooner. We don't need another 3 years to switch to a different brand of home compost, or 9 years for mushroom growers to sort their brand. What measures will be put in place to prevent peat grown imports too?
Yes, this will be a ban on sale when we do it, and we're working on the consultation now. It'll be a ban on sale, so it will affect imports. And in fact, most of the peat that we sell is now imported. There are still one or two sites where peat is excavated here in the UK, but the bulk of it's imported. And I think the point that I'd make is when the reason it'll take a bit of time is we need primary legislation for it. That is, we need a bill in Parliament to come forward. There's a convention on these things that you do need to consult before you make a major change of that sort. So we will be consulting first later this year. It's usually about 3 months that a consultation lasts before you would give a response. And then we have to draft the legislation, and then we have to get a slot in Parliament to get the legislation through, which realistically is something that we would get to, you know, maybe in a year or so's time. So you're already into sort of late 2022, and then you need the regulating powers to do it. So these things always sadly take a little bit longer than we would like. The only thing I would say though is a bit like with electric cars. Once you send a powerful signal which says we are ending, we're going to end this, that's the direction of travel in 2024, it is surprising how the market will start to move. And I think what we will see now that we've announced that is the end point, just as with electric cars, you'll see the market move. Garden centres will start to source peat alternatives because they want to be ready for it. They're not going to want to have an overnight revolution. And I think therefore we will see quite a clear glide path to no more horticultural peat. So it doesn't mean that nothing will happen over the next few years.
Thanks. And Jonathan.
Yeah, so following on from what you just said, George, there's a number of questions around construction. I think Jill Bruce is coming up as a winner again. I'll read her question. No new technology is needed to change building regulations. Other European countries have been building passive house, zero carbon homes for many years. This is not within the scope of local authorities. Currently, they cannot enforce zero carbon standards, only request, which developers can and do ignore. Just as the car industry is moving rapidly to EVs because they have a date when current technology becomes obsolete, the construction industry will not change to zero carbon practice till they're given a date when all new buildings must be zero carbon. When will government show leadership on this?
And I'm not going to sort of stray into another minister's area, but I do know that Robert Jenrick in MHCLG is looking really closely at this, and it's absolutely recognised that we're going to need to strengthen regulations in this area. to ensure, at the very least, as the first step, that all new building is, is carbon neutral. So there's a planning bill that obviously is coming up probably next year or later this year, and I know that this is an issue that he's looking at really closely.
Thanks, George. I want to pick up on water quality. We've got a couple of questions. One is from Gavin Paul about the general condition of seawater and what we could do to improve that. But I want to particularly pick up on, if the function stays steady, on a question that's relevant to clean water. Hopefully you can deal with the seawater as well. It says, I do not expect you to answer my question on the specific, but we are concerned about contaminated streams and water caused by historic mining. Now, you'll know that, given your constituency. We now face the very local prospect of the resumption of base metal mining to 3 miles from a picturesque port. Since it is now believed that the clean seawater is a potential source of carbon retention, how can that be justified?
Well,
so really it's about permissions for new mining.
I don't know the specific case, but I was no. I did have cause to get involved because it's in my constituency regarding South Crofty, where, as some on the call know, there's been sort of tentative plans and hopes that we might. There's a developer there that hopes they might be able to reopen commercial tin mining at South Crofty, and a lot of work was done with the Environment Agency to establish that if they were to dewater the mine, what kind of water treatment would be needed to ensure that the water that is taken out of the mine doesn't lead to terrible pollution in the Red River again, where we've seen in places like the Tuckinghall Valley, a recovery in water quality and a recovery for nature. So a lot of work was done, and they actually had established a project in that instance. Sadly, it's delayed because in the usual sort of way, the price of tin went down, and so everything was stalled and they couldn't raise the money to move things forward just yet. But the plant that they were going to build would mean that the water quality improved, because at the moment you do have some runoff coming out of those old mines. It does still contain contaminants, including things like arsenic, but albeit at quite low levels. But the water treatment plant that they were doing would have actually removed those contaminants. There would have been a sort of net gain, if you like, for water quality. So it's an area that is complex, but sometimes if you've got a project, provided they're doing the water treatment, and if they have a project, they would actually need to get a permit from the Environment Agency, and the Environment Agency should at that point step in and have certain requirements for water treatment. It can actually help, but I don't know enough about the specific case, I'm afraid. But I'm not sure whether it's in your constituency, Derek, or one of our other colleagues. Yeah. But I'm sure if you pick it up with whoever your MP is, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to write to me, and I can look at it.
Thank you, George. I mean, it's an important point for you and I, actually, because for many years you and I and other colleagues have looked at the lithium potential of Cornwall. We'd like to hear more about that in the next few weeks. But actually, for the general public, there's no way of them fully understanding what that process actually is, and actually how what is extracted from our existing mines, what actually would happen with the various products or things that come out of that brine. So maybe there's some work that we can do with that sector to really communicate to the public about how any risks are managed and in fact removed, because my understanding is that when the process is finished, the liquid itself is actually clean water and can be used for irrigation, etc. I don't know if that is it, but the location would suggest that might be the concern. So over to you, Pippa. Pippa, yeah.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of concern that the Environment Bill might not have sufficient teeth to do the job. So I'm just going to raise Helena Ritter's question, which is, will the Environment Bill properly enshrine the independence of the Office of Environmental Protection into law and strengthen its regulatory power by removing the government's ability to advise the OEP?
It will be completely independent. We've selected the chair, Dame Glenys Stacey, who's got a good track record at setting up and running a number of different independent regulators. The board interview process is complete, and we'll shortly be, confirming the members of that. And it's set up to operate as a completely independent, impartial body. The only thing is there is a power there, which is actually a feature we have for a number of these regulators, which is just to be able to issue government advice about how it should approach its own strategy. And this is quite I think a difficult thing for people to conceptually get, but you have to have a balance between that independence and accountability. So if you had an organization that had no parameters and it could entirely decide exactly what it wants to do, there becomes a question, which is what happens if it starts to do something that is not consistent with the powers and the intentions under the act that established it. And because we don't want to fetter its impartiality, the Environment Bill itself is quite mute about what it should do on those functions. And we did consider whether you should have a schedule, but then there was a view that would in some ways might constrain how it could evolve. But at the same time, you want it to remain anchored in terms of delivering the role that Parliament envisaged. And the view is that the best way to do that is to simply have that ability to issue guidance about how it should approach. And that's quite a normal feature. I think there's a similar one for the Commission for Racial Equality. I think there's a similar sort of power that's associated with that body, and that's also independent.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Julia.
I put a couple of questions together along the same lines as Pippa's. This is what work is happening to align and make legally binding the strong targets in the Environment Bill within the timeframes of the UK's NDCs, that's the National Determined Contributions for 2030. And what conversations is the Minister having with other ministers and with other departments and with the COP26 unit about this?
So I'm part of a cabinet subcommittee called the Climate Action Implementation Committee, which actually consists of all of the government departments that have got the biggest involvement in tackling this challenge. So it includes the Treasury, because obviously they're often called upon to provide funds for certain projects, the Department for Transport, MHCLG, and also DEFRA, and also the COP Secretariat also are attending that at the moment, because of course everything we're doing at the moment is quite heavily plugged in to what we are also doing in the run up to COP26. So there is a government subcommittee that focuses on these things. In terms of our commitments, in relation to climate change, the relevant legally binding commitments we have are the carbon budgets. So carbon budget 4 and 5. 4 is about to be upon us, 5 shortly after, and then carbon budget 6 takes us out to 2035. Those are the legally binding targets that we work to. And then of course we have net zero in 2050. And we regularly, it's a big challenge, it's a stretching target for everybody, because these aren't easy things to do. But we have a regular monthly meeting where we discuss what measures are needed on different fronts in order to get towards that. And a lot of what I set out earlier around the peat strategy, the tree planting strategy, electric vehicles, dealing with boilers in people's homes, these are exactly the sort of bread and butter policy issues that we discuss and try to fit them into the right trajectory to ensure we hit those targets.
Thanks, George. Jonathan.
I'm going to read Maggie Frigard's question. Will there be a strong and independent office for environmental protection that can enforce important targets like this and hold current and future governments to account? I'm sceptical about how bad practice by managers of land will be corrected. Currently, destruction of nature is widespread and goes punished. The Environment Agency is so weak that perpetrators of bad practice are not afraid of them, and witnesses of bad practice don't think it's worth reporting. I understand that this would be better if there were an independent office for environmental protection, which should be much better funded. The funding of the Environment Agency was reduced several years ago.
Yes, so the OEP, the Office of Environmental Protection, will be independent, and it'll have a number of functions. Some of them will be commenting, for instance, when we set our targets, there's a statutory role for the OEP to comment on those, whether they're ambitious enough, whether they're deliverable, whether we have the right policy framework in place to deliver them. There's then a role for them annually when we publish our update on the Environment Improvement Plan, for them to basically scrutinise that and to give a commentary on progress towards our legally binding environmental goals. And then there's a third role for them, which is very much in the enforcement area, and that is where a public body is failing to enforce the law, then they have a watchdog function to challenge that. And so if government, whether it's a minister or if it's one of our agencies, is not enforcing environmental legislation, then there's a role for the OEP in addressing that. And they can, if necessary, if it comes to a dispute and can't be settled through that process of discussion and mediation through their oversight role, well, then they've got the option to take legal action against government and seek court order.
Thank you for that. I was going to ask Virginia Davis' question, but it seems to have disappeared. But the question was basically, the Environment Bill commits to net gain biodiversity in the UK, but does it also seek to control the environmental impact of imports? So, for example, soya from where we may have previously had Amazon rainforest, or even where products have been made using coal-fired energy. So is there anything that the Environment Bill can do to actually manage the harm that consumer spending and consumer imports might inflict on other countries?
Yeah, we did consider this when I first came into this post about 9 months ago, and there's a logic to moving from an emissions-based regime where you just measure your carbon emissions, as we do now, and as every country in the world does internationally now, to something that is based on what would be called consumption. Because if I take an example close to home in the case of agriculture, if we were to do something that led to a big decline in our own livestock industry and livestock production here with cattle and sheep and so on, well, you might say your emissions have gone down. But if actually all that's happening is you are buying beef and lamb from a faraway country that's got lower standards, and putting it on a ship and having carbon emissions, well, then your consumption is still having that impact on carbon. So there is an argument for moving to what's called a sort of consumption-based approach. The Treasury are looking at it. The reason we decided, having looked at it, that we couldn't do it at this juncture is that it's quite complicated. The principle is probably right, but the complexities of how you would calculate it are quite difficult. And although the Treasury are taking a look at this and doing a piece of work on it, it isn't something we're going to be able to switch to overnight. But I think everyone accepts that in the longer term, at some point, once there's an agreement on the right methodology, something that is closer to a consumption-based approach probably makes more sense.
We've wrestled with that in this very event previously, so we understand a bit about the complexity of that. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Pippa.
Well, I'm just looking at a question from Robert Selwood, who says, can you comment on the fact that subsidies to fossil fuel companies in the UK are £10.5 billion? I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's a question.
I don't know. I'm going to be really honest, because I'm not going to try. I haven't heard that.
I can answer that, George.
You can. Go on, Derek.
Yeah. So this is the VAT reduction. So this is this is genuinely the truth. It's the 5% VAT on energy, whereas obviously everything else is 20%. And so the implication of that question is that if we were to stop that, energy bills would have to pay 20% VAT rather than 5%. That I've looked at this, and so that is where that figure comes from, and I'm 100%. That's and the Commons Library confirmed that is where that figure comes from.
Okay, I've got it. So I mean, so the issue there really, so it's a lower. If we're clear about the definitions, it's less a subsidy, it's a lower tax. So it's a lower band of tax for a fuel, and I would imagine, and I'm again, because it's an area of policy that I'm not responsible for, I would imagine that is linked to the issue of people's heating bills. You know, we all know that fuel poverty, you know, is an issue, and so often you have to try and balance these sorts of questions. And just as we don't have VAT on food at all, I suspect that it's in a similar vein, that because heating is an important part of essential part of people's life, it means that you can get fuel poverty for exactly the same reason we don't have VAT on food. There's a lower rate on heating fuel.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Which will obviously disappear as the government move homes onto more renewable energy, renewable forms of heating, there's quite an ambitious target on that. So sorry to interrupt there, George. Julia.
Oh, thank you. Got another one on farm payments here. This is from Simon Elliott, and he says, how can we ensure that these measures, i.e. changes in farm payments, still enable UK farmers to be competitive, such that UK shoppers can still afford local, low food mileage, high welfare standard food?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something that we are looking closely at. So, you know, my view is what we have at the moment is a problem with poor profitability in farming. And the approach in recent years has been to say, so let's put a subsidy there to sort of plug the gap, make sure that they at least break even or make a small margin. And what we probably need to do is to step back and say, how do we unpack that and actually, rather than treat the symptom of the problem, work out how we can address the causes of poor profitability. And so the Agriculture Act that we passed last year does a number of things. It enables us to set up schemes where we pay farmers and reward them for what they do for the environment. Now, under the current schemes, under the old Common Agricultural Policy, the principle behind the payment rates for what they did for the environment was something called income foregone. And what that really said is, if you do a good turn for the environment, we'll compensate you for your loss, but we won't give you a penny more than that. And that really begrudges farmers a margin for engaging enthusiastically in these sorts of schemes. So one of the things that we want to do is that as we get rid of the arbitrary subsidies, actually have more generous payment rates for what we do want farmers to do for the environment. Firstly, so that we can get more universal uptake. Secondly, so that farmers can see that it's worth their while and it becomes a no-brainer for them to engage in the schemes, and it actually contributes to their margin. If we want them to farm in a way that's sensitive to the environment, improves water quality, creates habitats for invertebrates and farmland birds and so on, well then we want to be able to financially reward them for creating that space for nature. And then the other thing we need to do is to look at unfairness in the supply chain, because farmers tend to be smaller, more fragmented businesses. They end up being price takers in the supply chain, and you have quite large processors and large retailers who have all of the clout in the market. So we've also introduced a power to bring in regulations to improve transparency and fairness in the supply chain with fairer contracting terms, so that you can actually firm up the farm gate price that farmers get. Because if they get a fairer share of the value of the food that they produce, they'll be less reliant on those subsidies. So it's a combination really of trying to address the causes of poor profitability, make sure farmers get a fairer price for their produce, help them reduce their costs, but also properly reward them for engaging in the new schemes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Jonathan.
I'm going to read Charmian Lark's question, which is, I've recently read literature on carbon budgets and how the world needs to rapidly achieve zero carbon emissions. The most recent work shows that there is no carbon budget left at all for meeting the Paris 1.5 degree limit on global heating. Also, the present trend takes us to the unsafe 2 degree figure, which could easily trigger hothouse Earth. What do you think is needed for the government to take this risk seriously and instigate enough change in our systems to help meet this survival target?
Well, I mean, I suppose, I do understand this, and one of the things that it's a long way off that people are thinking about. Getting to net zero by 2050 is itself quite a challenge, but one that we are committed to and legally now committed to. Because the challenge you have is a lot of the work on things like planting new trees. Well, trees take a long time to grow. It takes a good 20, 25 years before they come into their own. So the work that we're doing right now, and we are acting with urgency, trebling our tree planting rates over the next few years, that work will still take a good 20 years, 25 years before it really comes into its own. And that's why, because of the reliance and the speed at which these natural systems change, that's one of the reasons it takes a little bit longer to get to net zero. But people also recognize that once you hit net zero, you're probably then having to maintain that trajectory so that you get into, if you want, a net negative. So you don't get to net zero and plateau, you keep going, so that you then, in the latter part of this century, start to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, send the trend in the other direction, and then you can pull things back, back from the brink. And now I know there is this argument that there's a sort of trigger point beyond which those natural systems just start to emit carbon, that you get to a sort of no return zone, and that is something that's a concern that people look at. But it's why we're doing everything as quickly as we possibly can, and why actually we're probably working faster than any other country. We do need. It's why COP26 is so important. Unless we can get countries like China and India really on board with this as well, it will be difficult to get the change that we all want to see.
Thank you for that, George. Thank you, Jonathan. Loveday Jenkin, who, congratulations on your re-election, Loveday. She's asked a question which I've wrestled and had meetings to number 10 on this, because it obviously presents a dilemma, which I'm sure you'll pick up on, George. Local renewable generation and storage schemes, will there be any government support for these? And actually, it's more than generation, but you'll also be familiar with the plan or the thoughts around community networks, energy networks. So have you got any? Have you got any idea about how the government might support, or how plans to support local energy and storage?
There has been some work done on this, and there was a lot of interest some years ago in sort of decentralized energy systems. Getting more, getting solar on roofs, for instance, and of course battery technologies come on quite a lot, so it's easier now to store that and use it rather than have to feed it into the grid in a way that used to happen. So there is a role for that. And there's also some interest, and I know that Bayes have got some work going on around heating systems, particularly for sort of in some of those city areas, for sort of blocks of flats where you might have ground source heat pumps that can service the entire block. And there's a lot of potential for this, particularly on heating systems, but also on some of those energy systems as well. So I'm not sure what the latest is, but certainly a slightly more decentralized approach to energy regeneration has been something we've tried to encourage for some time.
Yeah. Well, my conversation number 10 was focusing on around how that could be delivered, but also the challenge that presents to national energy security, and obviously making sure that the grid and everything else can cope. We had a really interesting event that Sustainable Penzance put on Saturday around solar panels in particular. But one thing in terms of the storage, one thing that I learned on Saturday was that actually an electric car can also become a battery to hold energy that you could then use for your house, which I thought was really interesting concept. Something apparently that might present challenges for Western Power in terms of energy going the wrong way down the grid. But that all this stuff needs to be developed. Many years ago, George, you may remember that under the Faraday challenge, a Cornish company secured a lot of cash to develop their ideas for storage. I think it's a Falmouth-based company. I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Pippa.
Well, I would like to ask Collie Whitelaw's question, which takes us back to farming, saying farmers are currently scared and need support. They especially need help with rainwater harvesting and knowledge around soil health building. Might you address this, please? Everyone is passing the buck. Also, are you behind the Sustainable Food Trust Matrix recently launched by Prince Charles? It would be great if Britain could lead the way on agroecological land management and farming. Final question, can you confirm that ELMS will pay market gardens using minimum till organic methods?
Yeah, so in a few weeks' time, we're going to be saying more about the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is the part of the new land management scheme that we're launching next year. That is going to have modules in there with incentives for farmers to engage in approaches around soil health, and that will look at managing, nutrition in the soils, but also looking at supporting things such as minimum till or strip tilling or no-till type systems. So, and then on agroecology and agroforestry, we are looking at that as well. This is in particular how you can get more trees in the farmed landscape, particularly in some of those pastures. So on both counts, yes, we are looking at that. And when it comes to water quality, we are just about to quadruple the size of our catchment sensitive farming scheme to really help farmers deal with the challenge of diffuse pollution and make sure they've got all of the advice that they need and support they need, crucially, to improve that infrastructure. So quite a lot going on all of those fronts.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Julia.
This question, Minister, isn't for your department, but I'd like to put it to you anyway. And it's a question that's very close to a lot of people's hearts. It's when electric car charging outside houses in dense housing areas, such as battlefields in Penzance, would be near impossible. Should we not be looking at hydrogen hybrids rather than 100% electric? And why not move the natural gas network to hydrogen, as most modern boilers can move to hydrogen?
Well, on that latter point, that is one of the things that's being actively considered. And we're not there yet, and we haven't got a plan, but and they haven't perfected it. But there are pilots that are going on that are looking at, I think it's happening at the moment with a small village, I can't remember where it is, but looking at whether they can use the existing natural gas infrastructure to effectively transport hydrogen in future, so that you could, do a conversion of boilers or have new boilers that would run on hydrogen. Now, all of this is still a little way off. There's still a lot of work to do, but that is actually being looked at. And on electric vehicles, well, the general view at the moment is that hydrogen power could have quite a utility, particularly when it comes to heavy goods vehicles, where you've got heavy loads and where probably electric won't be able to cope. Although there are now some electric buses that are working quite well. And when it comes to cars, the truth is that the charging technology is coming on really quite quickly, and so we think now we're getting to some of the sort of approaches where it might be a bit like going to the filling station and putting the pump in, and it takes a few minutes to fill up. What they're actually starting to see is it might be the case that if people can charge outside their home, well, they would probably still do that and have that option. But that for quite a lot of others, it might be the case that they go to a car park somewhere, plug the car in for 5 or 10 minutes, and it's charged and fully charged and ready to go the distance. So the capacity and technology around charging is really coming on quite significantly. And if that could be reduced to the point that going to charge your car wasn't that different to going to the filling station to fill up with petrol, then you start to get into a very different sort of place.
Thanks. In Claire Perry's time as Energy Minister, I suggested that our garages could be converted to hold batteries, little robots that would just change the batteries in the car, and maybe a bigger car might have several batteries. But that wasn't something she felt the industry would accept, which is a shame. But Jonathan, over to you.
I'm actually going to ask my own question, which is really, is the government behind the scenes planning any kind of public awareness raising or education campaign? Just I mean, it feels to me like we're in the late 1930s almost, and Mr. Chamberlain hasn't come back from Hitler his piece of paper yet, but once that happened, then there was this Central Office of Information that was pouring out material, dig for victory, is your journey really necessary, all that sort of stuff. Here in Penzance, the council has funded a CIC called Sustainable Penzance, and every household in the parish received an envelope from the council with a letter from the mayor saying, this is serious, you need to take action, and here's a whole load of tips on what to do and that sort of stuff. We've had a range of responses to that. Some people saying, wonderful, thank goodness, at last somebody's doing something, but also a lot of abusive ones as well, saying, the council's been hijacked by a load of nutters, that kind of stuff. You should be spending money on filling potholes, not this kind of thing. And it really feels it needs central government to be doing parallel things that back up what can be done locally.
Yeah, I hear what you say, Jonathan. I think we've come a long way in the last 10 years in terms of public awareness, and we do at every opportunity. We make the point and the issue and try to get as much attention as we can around this particular issue. And the Climate Change Committee, in their most recent report, did say that we will probably need some behavioural change as well. Technologies will get us a long way, but there will probably need to be behaviour changes where some people might make some changes to their diet, if not not complete changes, where some people may have to think differently about journeys they take and whether they need to take them, or whether we should bank what we've learned over the last year and do more meetings via Zoom, for instance, like we are now. So I think there will probably there is going to have to be some of that behaviour change, but I think it comes back to what I said earlier on. It's always important to recognise the progress that we've made on all of these things, including on public awareness and engagement in these matters. Otherwise, people get daunted by the task and don't think and feel disempowered. And I think by recognising the progress that's been made in all of these areas, it gives people the confidence to keep going.
Okay. So yeah, thanks. Pepper, are you all right for a minute or two, George, or do you want to? Yeah,
I've got to go in a few minutes. I'm okay for about 2 or 3 more minutes. So if there's any other.
Okay, well, we're going to finish at 25. That's good. We're going to finish 25 past just to wrap up anyway. So, Pepper, I'm going to jump to you because.
Yes, can I just quickly ask a question from Rupert Manley, who says, how will the aviation industry meet net zero requirements with biofuels being implicated in rainforest destruction? And linked to that, when will aviation subsidies be stopped and frequent flyer taxes introduced? So that is about the government inducing behaviour change, really, and it's also about us doing things abroad which change our carbon footstep.
Yes, well, and obviously with the pandemic, we've had travel has gone down dramatically, and it remains to be seen whether people, choose to perhaps in future travel a bit less. It links to what I said earlier to Jonathan's point. There will need to be, some behaviour change. But in terms of how they decarbonise, I mean, biofuels, while not perfect, are I guess a step forward from conventionally produced jet fuel, in that they can be renewable if they're done the right way. The other thing that is, I know, being looked at on aviation is hydrogen again, but that's again it's some way off, and hydrogen can have dangers associated with it, as we all know. Things can go bang with hydrogen, so there's a caution about how quickly you could use that as a sort of energy source in things like aviation. But I know it's also something that's being considered.
Thanks, George. I'm going to come in there. David Harrison makes a really important point, and it's not something that lots and lots of people in the UK think it, even if they don't say it. And it kind of goes back to Jonathan's point about how do we get the public fully on board. So the point is, and this is the challenge from David, is given that the UK is estimated to only actually create or produce 2% of the world's emission, what are we going to do to get the other 98% addressed? Now you've already referred to that, but David Harrison isn't saying public confidence is the issue, but it is very difficult for Jonathan and others to say these are the difficult decisions you need to make, when actually there's still a huge amount of people that think, well, the impact is so very small on the global emissions. Why should I make those sacrifices? Yeah,
it's a challenge, and I think the answers really are twofold. One is the things we're doing, like COP26 and the engagement program I've got with other opposite numbers in other countries to try to build that ambition is crucial, because people do want to see that and it's great. The United States now is back. They're committed to this agenda. I met John Kerry earlier this week to discuss it, and that's important, because having that US leadership back on this agenda has been an important change. And we then need countries like China and India to also make the right sorts of commitments, and it's quite challenging at the moment with China, because they're saying that they don't think they've even reached peak emissions yet, and they're reluctant to commit to an NDC. So there are some challenges, but we've got to keep working on that, because I think when people see the whole world doing things and other countries committing to things, they then realize, and it has more meaning, what they might be able to do individually.
Thanks, that's great, thanks. Unless the other panel will have a burning question, I'm going to let George leave us. Thanks, George. Really helpful, thank you so much. We've had about between 50 and 60 on the call this afternoon. We meet once a month, and we've covered some really interesting topics, both very local action and also obviously now what's happening nationally. We're hoping to get the Commission on Climate Change to come and speak in a future meeting, and you've heard about the next meeting, which is, just to remind everyone, is the 16th of June at 4 p.m. But as Pippa said earlier, we will send out a feedback form, because we need to change the time, because people have obviously, more and more people are going back to work. We also want to make sure that we're scratching where you're itching. So George, thank you ever so much, Secretary.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. I think we've covered a lot of areas, and there's obviously a lot of technical detail on this call with people that are committed. So thank you all very much. It's been a good discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Derek. Bye.
Thanks, George. Take care. So again, that meeting, 16th of June, 4 o'clock. I'm never going to say it as well as Julia did, so I should hand back to her. But but we have a small, you can see the panel, we're kind of the core team that pull these meetings together, but we do want to hear from everybody who you want to hear from, what issues you want to wrestle and grapple with. And the point that, Jonathan, that you're making about how do we how do we reach beyond those that are already signed up, or how do we get to people that are not yet engaged or feel that anything we ask of them is an imposition? That's something that maybe we can everybody who's here today can help us to grapple with. But we're going to send out a feedback form to the information we've got, to the data we've got, and if you can feed it in and suggest how you want to go forward, that's great. We will take a break at August. We've got a meeting in June, a meeting in July, and then we'll reconvene in September. And we've got that programme until the September. We've got June and July organised. September is up for negotiation. So thank you, Pippa, Jonathan and Julia. Thank you, Megan, for keeping us all in the right place. I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.